There we go. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's STBB webinar. My name is Liani Steenkamp. I head up the marketing department at STBB, and today we are super excited to be sharing with you our session with a BEE expert, Adam Ismail, who is in our Claremont department, commercial department, and he'll be sharing with you everything you need to know to understand BEE. So without further ado, I'm going to be handing over to Adam Ismail. Sorry, just before I do hand over, just a few house rules. We will be dealing with questions at the end of the session, so you're more than welcome to post them as we continue during the session, and we'll do it, then open the floor for questions once Adam is done. If we do not get to all the questions, we are happy to assist and answer them afterwards. We'll also be sharing Adam's contact details and our commercial department's contact details with you. Also regarding the recording will be made available, as well as the attendance certificates. Please look out for them only from tomorrow, as we will still be processing them today. But yes, that's everything from my side. And without further ado, I am then going to be handing over to Adam.
Thanks, Liani, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to spend some time with us on this topic. And let me just start off by sharing my slides. Okay, there we go. Liani, you can see it on your side?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. So let's go. All right, so today we're talking broad-based Black economic empowerment, or triple BEE, as it's more commonly known. Just a bit about myself. I'm a lawyer. I practice here in Cape Town at STBB's Claremont office. I'm an executive consultant here, and my expertise is mergers and acquisitions, foreign investment, and BEE, and all things related. And I've been doing this for about 25 years now. All right, so look, I thought a useful starting point is just to sketch a picture of where we're coming from. So we're coming from quite a deep history that has brought us here. We all know the history, we don't need to rehash it. But the foundations of economic transformation is actually born out of the Freedom Charter of the ANC. If you pull out a copy or Google it, you'll see it then in a sort of a very rough and raw form. And post our first democratic elections, that principle made its way into South Africa's first constitution. And the constitution, being the supreme law of the land, had laid the foundations for what economic transformation means, and that impact and effect should be given to it. So post 94, it was a bit like the Wild West. You know, I guess nobody knew what they were doing. It was all very new, and it was very much a hit and miss in those early days. So 1995 to 2005, those sort of first 10 years, saw lots of activity, but also a lot of failure. And I guess it comes from a place where we were still grappling with our, shall we call it, political and social freedoms being recognized under the presidency of Nelson Mandela at the time. And sort of the economic part of it only really came into real focus after Madiba stepped down as president and under Thabo Mbeki's reign. And it was really under his presidency that life was given to these laws. You know, before then, it was very much characterized by what we call the usual suspects. There was a handful of Black people doing all the deals and making lots and lots of money, and they were called the usual suspects. And the names are our current President Cyril Ramaphosa, Patrice Motsepe, Tokyo Sexwale at the time, and many others. Under Thabo Mbeki's presidency, there was a more sort of concerted look at how do we focus the BEE, and there was the introduction of some laws in 05 and codes of good practice in 07, which gave life to what the Constitution meant by economic transformation. And this provided a lot of guidance to business on what needed to be done and how it needed to be done. And it also introduced this concept of BE being more broad-based, meaning that the participants and the beneficiaries of BE cannot just be a small group of Black elite. It's got to be spread wider. It's got to include staff, community groups, non-profits, women and youth. And from about 2007 onwards, there was this roadmap, and we'll go through some of the detail a bit later of what BE should look like and feel like. And then I guess Murphy's Law struck us just as we were sort of settling into what all of this meant, and we were getting used to these new laws. 2008, we were really sort of hitting our stride. A recession then hit. And the way BE works is business needs to be thriving and flourishing for the BE model we have really to work. And the recession that kicked in the sort of second half of 2008 resulted in the collapse of many BE deals. It slowed down new BE deals. And the problem was, BE deals weren't working, but there was this law that required business still to comply with it. And that's when people sort of started now grappling with how are we going to make not necessarily BE work, my scorecard work, because I still need to do business in very, very tough times. And I think we took a couple of steps backwards at that stage because of fancy structuring and structures that had very little substance to them. And what then followed was a decline in the success of BE, quite a sharp decline, which resulted in the government promulgating new laws in 2015, which was an attempt to sort of rejig the compliance with BE to make it a lot harder so that people would exert themselves a bit more in complying with BE to make a greater impact. And those laws then also introduced a concept of fronting. And fronting is all about where you purport to be complying with BE in form, but in substance, what's actually happening is not really benefiting or furthering the goals of BE. So fronting now had a definition, and there were serious sanctions that came with fronting, fines of up to 10% of businesses' turnover, and there was even criminal sanctions, including fines on individuals and possible jail time. So we're in the sort of post-2015 era. We sort of 8 years down the line. Where do we find ourselves now? Is it time for another overhaul? Is what we're currently doing working? And I'm going to try and delve into some of those sort of very deep questions, and maybe do a bit of crystal ball gazing and see what the future holds for us. This was a cartoon that I saw in the early 2000s, and I've sort of always kept it with me, but it sort of just shows how profoundly BE's impact sort of South Africa at so many levels. And I mean, no need to repeat it. Everyone can just have a look there, and this one always puts a little smile on my face. All right, so I guess the big question today is, here we are. I mean, we're coming up for 30 years post-democracy. We've had our BE laws in place now for just under 20 years. Is B still relevant? Is it something that we should still be thinking of? So, I mean, what we've got to keep in mind is that B is a very deliberate process by government, backed up by policy and legislation. And what is the aim of it? The aim is to try and correct imbalances of the past. And those imbalances were brought about by institutional apartheid, and we all know who the group is that was affected by it. And it's an attempt to bring that group back into the economy. So there's a couple of fundamental challenges that we face. The first one is, like in many other countries where we sort of try to borrow models from, the excluded people were normally minorities, which made it a bit easier. In our instance, it was more than 85% of the population that was excluded from the economy. And, at the time of our democracy, if you looked at proportionally the racial breakdown of the economy and who owned what to the population, I mean, it was clearly skewed. And, looking at numbers today, there have been substantial improvements, but not much has changed. And I'll make the point further down is, this is but just one of government's policies or interventions to try and do this impossible job of leveling the playing fields between the minority and the majority. BEE's always been a bit of a hot topic. If you sit at the dinner table, depending on where your dinner table is in the country, there could be various views on it. I've no doubt that in the last few years, BEE has got a very bad reputation. And what has driven that? I think there's a couple of things that's driven it. I mean, there's the larger political situation where BEE has become synonymous with corruption, state capture, and cadre deployment. Its limited impact. It still only continued to make a very small black elite extremely wealthy and help a middle class grow, but it's not really had any impact on the greater majority of Black South Africans who are sort of lower at classes low and some even below the breadline and in poverty. It's also seen as an additional cost to doing business in very testing times. And I mentioned the impact of recent recessions and how those recessions have also not helped boost the reputation of BEE on both sides of the fence, because for Black participants coming into these deals, wanting to change their lives, for many of them, these deals have not created any value, even after 10 years of participation, just because of economics. And in some instances, I know of transactions where Black people have actually entered into B deals and come out poorer on the other end. So we've got to keep in mind that the bad rap actually comes on both sides of the fence. And then BEE, other than a monetary cost, there's other costs that come with it, and one of that is if you own 100% of a business, that you're going to have to give up a portion of it or a stake of that, and that tends to be difficult at times, and especially so for family-owned businesses. And then I also just wanted to give ourselves a bit of a reminder here on what does Black entail. So it's Black South Africans. And that's Black South Africans, whether by birth or descent, or alternatively by naturalization, but that naturalization must have occurred pre-1994. And Black South Africans, that's the generic term for African, colored, Indian, and Chinese. So let's look at the other side. Is there any good news? Does the good news outweigh the bad? And this is still in the context of whether B is still relevant today. And the simple truth is it's a matter of perspective. It depends on sort of what's driving your world at the moment, which depends on this answer. You know, if you're sitting in a mansion in a very affluent suburb, and you've not, all you see is the bad, you may say, listen, you know, BEE was a bad idea, should have never happened, and we need to kill it and get rid of it as soon as possible. If you're sitting in a shack without electricity, running water, or a working toilet, you probably have the same view, but for very different reasons. You say, you know, these are spectacular failure, hasn't worked, and we need to do away with it. And if you're sitting somewhere in the middle and somebody who has benefited from BEE or from any of the employment equity or affirmative action legislation that's been put in place, you may have a different view. But what I want to say to you is there is good news stories as well. They may not make the news as often as the bad news does. And who knows why that is? Maybe people just don't know about it. Maybe good news doesn't sell as good as bad news. But the truth is, BEE has changed hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Black people's lives in the country. And I'd like to think, and I guess I've seen examples of it, that those hundreds of thousands or millions of Black people feel a moral and ethical duty to pay it forward, and in their own small way, through the wealth they've made, they do pay it forward. And this can be seen by this creation of this very wealthy Black elite, as well as a rising middle class. There's also been a rise in what's called broad-based ownership schemes. These are groups of people who have pooled themselves to more effectively benefit from BEE and spread that wealth over a very broad group of people. And there's a couple of really good examples of that. Currently, you know, these are broad-based groups who have been around for decades, have really made substantial economic advancement and have hundreds and thousands of beneficiaries. And I've mentioned a few here. There's the Kagiso Charitable Trust, Mine Workers Investment Corporation, the Women's Development Bank. I mean, the list goes on. These are very responsible groups, you know, who in a very sophisticated way looked out for the correct deals, made a substantial amount of money, and instead of putting it in their own pockets, has used it to benefit a broader group of people and communities, and their work goes on. And I mean, feel free to visit any of these entities' web pages just to get a sense of what they do and how they do it. And then lastly, there has been an empowerment of employees, because many companies have chosen to not do BEE with outside organizations or people, but rather to keep it in-house and benefit their own people. And when we talk about the scorecard a bit later, I'll show you some of the ways in which that can be done. But what needs to be kept in mind is that, you know, BEE is a very, very small weight on the scale trying to tip the imbalance. You know, that imbalance will only be tipped once the broader socioeconomic issues are also dealt with, like health, like education, like housing, infrastructure, and, you know, all of those work together. And it may be that BEE is getting a bad rap because people are placing too much weight on it being the answer, while all these other very vital plug-ins are failing in our country. So is BEE compulsory? Is it something that must be on your compliance tick list, like registering with tax authorities and the like? And you know, when the new government came in and they had to go and investigate the various models that were available around the world, whether it was in Canada or in Indonesia or where else, there were many extreme examples, and I think they chose a relative middle ground. I mean, if you think of some of the extreme examples, which we'll see in Angola and in Zimbabwe, where you cannot do business unless a majority of your business is owned by locals. South Africa didn't choose that. Instead of taking a stick approach, which is beating people unless they do a particular thing, a more subtle approach was taken, which is for you, if you want to do business in certain types of sectors, then BEE compliance will definitely help you along. And how this started was where government needed to issue some sort of authorization or license. And at the time, the big examples were telecoms, when the cell phone networks came in, when gaming or the gambling industry started in South Africa, the issuing of licenses and mining. You don't get past go unless you be compliant in those industries. And then there's a second category, which is anyone who wants to do business with corporates who wish to comply with BEE for whatever reason. So you don't have to be BEE compliant, but if you are in certain sectors, you're not gonna grow your turnover unless you are BEE compliant. But you can choose to work in areas where BEE is not necessarily a driver to grow your market share or your turnover. Is anyone exempt from it? Yes, businesses with a turnover of less than 10 million. And this is mainly because government doesn't want to over-regulate small businesses and burden them with compliance costs. So if you have a business with an annual turnover of less than 10 million rand, you're already automatically compliant. Also, businesses who have just started up for the first year, if you're a new business, there's no need for compliance in the first year. But as you'll see later on, BEE compliance is a process. It's not something that happens overnight. There isn't a button you can press and it happens, or pay some money and it happens. It's BEE, I always say, is a journey, and you actually never arrive. It's just ongoing work. And the sooner you start, the better, because you'll start seeing the results. And often what happens is when you reach a position where you absolutely have worked for and get to, something often happens, and your BEE status could then be affected or go down, and then you're going to have to do some more work. I mean, a good example is if one of my biggest expenses as a business is my rental that I pay to my landlord, and you'll see from the scorecard that your procurement of goods and services impacts your scorecard. And I could have a brilliant landlord who's empowered, for the last 10 years and helped my scorecard. And, I've moved from a level 3 or level 4 to a level 1, and I'm so happy. And then when I reach level 1, the landlord decides to sell the property as it's entitled to do, and it sells it to somebody that's not Black empowered, and suddenly it impacts my scorecard. So sometimes what we do is we advise our tenants, where you're entering into a lease with a landlord because of their BEE credentials, is hard code and write into the lease that they must maintain those credentials. And if they sell it, they've got to sell the building to somebody who has the same or better BEE credentials. It's a bit hard sometimes, that negotiation, and you don't always get it right, but you've got to try. It's also just important to note that many companies are not necessarily legally obliged to comply with BEE, but they still do it. Big businesses do it either because they want to be seen to be responsible South African citizens, or they're listed on the JSE and the JSE requires it. All right, I don't want to spend too much time on the scorecards because everyone's been living with this for so many years. But so just a reminder, this is how BEE is measured. It's a balanced scorecard across 5 elements. You've got to score reasonably well on each of the elements to get a good score. Most people seem to fixate on the first element, which is ownership by Black people. And you'll see that it's only a quarter of the score. It's only 25 points. There are other elements: management, skills development, enterprise and supply development, which includes preferential procurement and socioeconomic development. And you've got to spend time and resources on each of these elements to get to a reasonably decent score. Ownership could actually be the easiest one, where you can just sell a stake in your business to a Black person who can sort of passively sit there and hold that and derive the benefits from it. Some of the others are a bit harder, especially transforming your management. And that's all the way from the senior management down to your junior management, as well as preferential procurement. Also important to keep in mind that various economic sectors have their own bespoke scorecards, which are sort of cut up in slightly different ways. The one that you have on the screen, that's the generic scorecard. That applies to all businesses who don't have sector codes. And what I've done there is I've just listed the current sector codes that are in play. There is talk of some new ones coming. I know the legal sector has been under the spotlight for quite a while, and we actually even have a draft sector code, which is taking a bit of time to finalize. And then when you add up your score on that B scorecard, what that gives you is a number, which is the middle column. If you score less than 40, you're non-compliant, and your rating, or your B rating, starts from 40 and more. Most businesses, the middle ground is to achieve at least a level 3 or level 4. But I mean, you'll see even that is between 80 and 95%. The last time I checked the scorecard, that's an A pass. You need an A pass, just to be, shall I say, relevant. And then level 1 and level 2, that's sort of super bonus points for anyone who can end up in those 2 categories over there. All right, so what I want to do is I want to maybe just spend a slide or two just talking about ownership. And why I want to speak about ownership is because, that's where a firm like STBB can help you in building your scorecard. So assume you've either done nothing on your scorecard or you've been working on the other 4 elements, but you've not been able to touch Black ownership yet, either because you're a family-owned business and you don't want minority shareholders in, or for some other reason. And the first question I get asked is, where do I start looking? And what I've tried to do in those first few bullets there is to talk about some of the low-hanging fruit. The first place must be internally, is people you trust, people you know, people who have a track record with you. Are there any senior management or Black employees that you can rope in to some sort of an ownership deal? If not, and you still want to have a broad impact, is go and see if there's a broad-based ownership scheme that you could interest. So this is normally some sort of not-for-profit public benefit organization that has professionally set themselves up to target Black ownership, to create a sustainable fund to fund their various altruistic activities. And these vary in size. There's some that's with billions of rands to hundreds of millions to millions, and smaller ones. Or you can reach out to business partners that you have. It may be a good supplier, it may be a good customer, associates, friends, and other networks. There's also private equity companies and professional Black investors. These are people who have made money through other BE deals, and they're looking to reinvest it to continue their growth, or they've raised money from third parties, which they're going to professionally manage and grow. And sometimes you could have a combination in your black ownership of some or even all of these different types of groups. It all depends on where you are in your own business. And I mean, the important thing here is, what it is that you're selling. Is your business profitable? What is the future outlook of the business looking like? And the like. But I'll talk about a few of those points a bit later. There are other alternatives to get black ownership points without selling your shares, and I've mentioned some of these there. So one of the ways of doing that is selling assets. If you sell a portion of your productive assets to a black-owned company and give them the ability to pay market value for these productive assets, and then use it to generate profit for themselves and grow from there, that can give you ownership points. So we see that quite a lot in the property market, where if I am operating my own distribution center, so I own the center, I operate it, and I distribute my products from it. What I can do is, if I sell my property to a black-owned company, I get two advantages. The first one is, because I've sold a productive asset to a black person, I get ownership points. And what I then do is I then lease that property back from the owner and pay them an agreed rental. And I then tick the box on my procurement scorecard because now I have a black landlord. So that's what black ownership is. That's what sale of assets is about. Then there's, if you're an EME, you're an exempted micro enterprise, you don't need to sell any black ownership because you already be compliant. Another option is if you can get your business to be 51% black owned, and that business's turnover is less than 50 million rand per annum, you automatically are B level 2. You don't need to complete any other of the elements of the scorecards. 51% black ownership, turnover of less than 50 million rand, you automatically are level 2. Obviously, when your turnover goes over 50 million, then you'll have to comply with the full scorecard again. There's also a concept of continuing consequences. A lot of us know this from the press as referred to as once empowered and always empowered. And the idea here is, if you've done a BE deal historically and it was successful and endured for more than 3 years, some of that points you can continue to carry onto your scorecard for a period of time. And then there's also equity equivalents. Equity equivalents apply mainly to multinationals who are investing into South Africa. And the idea here is that if you are a multinational that operates in many countries over the world and you have a global policy that you do not give off equity stakes in all those countries that you operate in, you can apply to the Department of Trade and Industry to make an equity equivalent. So instead of selling your shares because you meet these requirements, you can make a cash contribution to one of the economic policy objectives of the government. And there's many companies that have taken this up. So the big ones in the past have been Microsoft, IBM, Dell, and a few others. But it's quite hard to comply with the requirements, and it is quite a process to negotiate with government that agreement. And most people who come to me to say, look, I need BE, there's often something very pressing happening, and they need things done quite quickly, and they don't have the time to go through the process. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So once you've now broadly determined who your BE partner is going to be, there's a couple of questions you've got to ask yourself in structuring an appropriate transaction. The first thing you've got to decide is, what percentage of my company am I willing to give up? could be anywhere from 1% to 100%, although most companies aim for the compliance target in the ownership scorecard of 25%. Some other sector codes have a higher threshold, like I know the ICT charter requires 30%. Once you've decided how much you want to sell, we've got to then value what that's worth, because BE doesn't require you to give up your shares. That is an act of choice. It operates in a free market with a willing buyer and a willing seller. Often there's a B discount that's built in for various reasons, but you should be no less poorer if you do a BE deal at proper valuations. So once you know how much you're selling and what the purchase price is, then you've got to decide now, where must the money go? Because if a shareholder sells the shares, it ends up with the shareholder, and there's going to be certain tax consequences for the shareholder who's selling, mainly capital gains tax. Or is the company going to issue new shares and dilute the existing shareholders, in which case the company gets the money, and it may be that the company actually needs a capital injection, and your BE deal then actually kills two birds with one stone, which is getting your BE right and getting a capital injection. And a subscription for shares is normally a much more tax efficient route of doing things, because nobody's disposing of shares, you're creating new shares. There's no CGT event, and there is no security transfer tax that's payable. So now you know how much you're selling, you know what the price is, you know whether you're selling or you're issuing. The next question is, how's the BE guys going to pay for it? Do they have the cash? Are they going to borrow it from a bank? Or are we going to do something a little bit fancier, like a vendor financed loan or a notional loan? And just to explain those two concepts. A vendor loan is when the seller of the shares or the company who's issuing the shares says, look, you owe us the money, but you can pay us later, and you can pay us out of future dividends. And normally that's backed by security, pledges and cessions of the shares and the right. One thing you've just got to watch is, if you're issuing shares, our Companies Act doesn't allow you to issue shares that's not paid for. All shares issued by the company must be fully paid up, but the Companies Act does provide in section 40, sub 4 and 5, for a mechanism where shares can be paid for in a future date, and then that shares must be held in trust by a third party until it's paid for. All the voting rights and the dividend rights can be given to the black partners in the meantime. That amendment was introduced into the Companies Act in 2008 and was specifically geared towards helping vendor financed BE deals in the South African context. And notional loans is, I guess, it's similar to a vendor finance loan, other than, as the word suggests, notional. There isn't a real loan. It's a notional loan. It doesn't actually exist, but it creates a formula or a mechanism for how the B shareholders get their shares depending on the company's performance. And then the last category is this, what I call a nominal amount. That's the easiest way to do a BE deal, and this is more prevalent when you're starting a new business and it doesn't have any black shareholders, so particularly tech startups. If you're starting something from scratch and it's got no value, you can bring your BE partners in without having any burdensome funding structures. Or sometimes, sellers don't need the money, and they do nominal sales. Or the company's riddled with debt and it's not worth anything and it needs to trade out of the debt. And then also it can do it for a nominal amount. I just quickly want to talk about share option structures. This is something that's become quite popular nowadays. And the idea here is, if you give somebody an option to buy your shares and you don't actually sell it to them, you can get the BE points even while they hold the option, provided that they're entitled to vote those shares and entitled to all the economic interest flowing from those shares. I'd be very wary of this structure. It's not as simple as it sounds. BE is measured on substance over form. And I normally only recommend these share option schemes if there's at least 2 or 3 commercial rationales or drivers for why you did a share option as opposed to an outright disposal. Just bear in mind the definition of fronting is very broad, and we've got quite an aggressive regulator that I'll talk a bit about later, and you'd never want to answer some awkward questions around those. Another sort of trend that we're seeing is, because B's been around for so long, is many deals have either collapsed because of economics or performance of the company, or because they've just reached their term and everything has wound down. So what happens is the fact that those deals have become undone doesn't mean the company still doesn't need black shareholders. So what we've been doing is doing a lot of deals where we roll over those deals, sort of revive them again, or the company finds new B partners, learns from past mistakes, and then puts another one in place. And then as part of this process, I guess like with any type of merger and acquisition, there's agreements that need to be put in place, resolutions. There'll be various conditions that need to be met, particularly where there's funding. It's got to be properly planned, and you've got to have a timeline to implement that. Yeah, so want to talk quickly about some of the trends that we've seen and what does the future hold. So in 2015, when all these amendments came in, what the amendments also introduced was for the first time a regulator for BEE that had teeth. Historically, before 2015, BEE was sort of very informally regulated by the Department of Trade and Industry, and because it had no mandate or authority to do so, it was pretty much a toothless exercise. The BEE Commission sort of was breathed into law in 2015. It took a bit of time to get started up, and it sort of opened its office doors in 2016, 2017. Sort of became a lot more functional and outward focused. And it took quite a hard line on a couple of matters. And, sometimes I just got the sense that it was overplaying its hand, maybe overcompensating for the slow rate of transformation. But, with all regulators, a regulator is a creature of statute. They're regulated by law. They get their power and authority from law, and there's no way they can overstep those powers. We're still a constitutional democracy, and the rule of law is something that still governs South Africa, even though it doesn't feel like it sometimes. Rising from sort of some of the controversial statements made by the BEE Commission, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Ibrahim Patel, came out a few years ago with a very strong message that community trusts and employee trusts do constitute black ownership. He went into quite a bit of detail on what government expects around these, and that not that it's necessarily the preferred route, but it's a supported route. And following that statement, we saw a flurry of BEE deals from really large corporates, deals into the tens of billions, all done with employees, either exclusively or to a large degree. So Old Mutual, ABSA, Shoprite, PepsiCo, the list goes on, Astron, on Omnia. These are pretty complex deals, especially the tax, because when SARS looks at you as the company giving the employee a benefit, it wants to immediately tax it on the basis of income tax. But these are tried and tested routes. They are models that work, and we have some models that can work for small businesses as well, if you do want to empower your staff. Other developments is, the president, Cyril Ramaphosa appointed his own sort of black or BEE council recently. The previous BEE council was still appointed under the previous presidents, and they were sort of quite inert. So President Ramaphosa has sort of injected some new blood into the BEE Council, which is also a statutory body, not a regulator. It's a statutory body formed by the BEE Act, and its job is to advise the president on BEE. And the Minister of Trade and Industry and Competition also announced that they started a process of reviewing BEE and its effectiveness. And I mean, what I read between the lines here, and speaking to sort of some industry insiders, is while the government's not distracted by all the current issues in our country, whether it's load shedding or whether it was the disruptions in KZN or natural disasters or whatever else is on the agenda, if there is a free moment, they are making time to think about where BEE is, where it's come from, what's working, what's not working, and what does the next chapter look like. And you know, that begs the question, maybe it is time for a complete overhaul. But if it is time for complete overhaul, what are the options? Are there any other options? Or do we just stop? Do we say, listen, we've tried this for long enough. We've showed ourselves it can't work, not because we don't want to, it's just how the world works. Yeah, so that sort of brings me to my final slide, where I'm going to sort of try and wrap up the picture I've painted and ask a few questions and maybe give some of my views, and do a bit of crystal ball gazing. So, do we wish it away? I think the answer for me is no. And I say that for a couple of reasons. I think BEE does have a track record of helping disenfranchised people into the economy. And my fear is if you switch it off totally, and people aren't being driven to do it by themselves, that little success that we do have will stop. I think there can be no doubt that BEE has helped certain people. And if we don't fixate on the two extremes, which is the ultra wealthy and the ultra poor, and you just focus at that middle group, I think we've got to continue chipping away at that. But then that begs the question: has it done more good than bad, or is it the other way around? You know, look at state capture and what that's cost the economy, the country. But I mean, again, it begs the question: assume BEE laws never existed. I would argue that state capture and the Eskom debacle would have still happened. I don't think BEE is the fault or cause of all of that. I think BEE was sort of just one of the feeders or supporters of that, because it created a framework. So I still think there's still more good in BEE than bad, and I think it's just a few apples that are spoiling the battle. You know, I often give the analogy that South Africa, I mean, particularly Cape Town, is one of the murder capitals of the world. I still want to stay here, yeah, and I'm sure many of you still want to stay in this country and in Cape Town. The fact that with the murder capital, a few people who are really behaving badly, doesn't make all of us bad people. It's not like you come to Cape Town, you land in, there's a bunch of murderers walking around wielding guns and knives at every corner. And I'd like to apply the same. I'd like to, apply the same analogy here to BEE. Next question: will more of the same work? There's a famous saying: it is an insane person who does the same thing over and over and expect a different result. And I think that's very true for the current state of BEE. I would think that there's probably a need for some subtle changes in the short term, with a look to sort of more medium to long term rethinking and totally rejigging how we get people to participate in the economy. It may need some complete left field thinking, and thinking out of the box. But that's the responsible of the ruling party, whoever they may be. at the relevant time. Look, like I said, there are some good deals that are continuing and going on and doing pretty well. And what does the next chapter look like? I think that's one I don't have a view on. We've got to get rid of a couple of really fundamental hurdles, to get there. Number one, we've got to get our economy on an accelerated growth cycle. 1% or less economic growth is not going to help the cause. People are just struggling to survive, let alone prosper. We've got to fix our infrastructure. We've got to deal with all the socioeconomic issues. It's the old thing. You can't teach a hungry child. How are you going to get the next generation to educate themselves, have access to an education, and actually on their own back contribute to the economy if we still have so much social imbalance? I think we've also got to think about what worked with BEE and keep that, and think about what didn't work and move away from that. And I guess this webinar is a bit sort of too short to get into that detail. I think a lot of people are also worried is, will government's next move just be like 2015, which is take me out of my comfort zone and just make it harder to comply? I think that's an option, I think that's an option. And again, if we go back to some analogies, it's a bit like parenting for those of you who are parents. And there's various ways to parent. You could be a strict parent, you could be a parent who's constantly berating your child, or you could be a parent who is more understanding and fostering and creating an environment. And I think it's going to depend what type of a parent the South African government is and what the next chapter is going to look like. Because the message from government is clear. Is South Africa, we have not done enough to achieve the economic transformation we as the ruling party would have liked to have seen. Neither in the timeline nor the scale. And they often just quote things like, look at ownership on the JSE as an indicator. Look at the C-suite of big corporates and see who's running those corporates and the like. Again, heavy philosophical debates here. Depending, it's a matter of perspective and also which side of the fence you sit on. And then a lot of you would have read in the press, there was in the last week or two, there was a lot of press about, new BEE transformation was coming in. And I just thought I'd just demystify what that is. That was the signing into law of the Employment Equity Amendment Bill of 2020. That has got almost nothing to do really with BEE and the ownership scorecard. It's got more to do with employment equity. And it did only three things in essence. Number one is it empowers the minister to create employment equity targets for various sectors of the economy. So a bit like you would have seen, there were sector codes I mentioned earlier on. The idea here is you can't have this blanket targets because an IT firm's different to a mine, for instance. So that's what that's about. And I guess we're all waiting to see what those targets look like. And I'm sure they won't be published unless there's some consultation into those industries. It also provides for labor officials to provide compliance certificates for employment equity. And I guess the one bit of good news is less compliance for smaller companies. So previously, if you were a company that had less than 50 employees, but your turnover was above a certain threshold, you needed to comply with the Employment Equity Act. That's been done away with now. If you have less than 50 employees, no matter what your turnover is, you're no longer what is called a designated employer, which means you no longer have those employment equity obligations. And almost an hour has flown past. I hope there were some useful insights there just to continue the discussion. And thank you for your time, and happy to, in the last 5-10 minutes, entertain a few questions. But other than that, thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Adam, for just demystifying the BE and the compliance aspects that go with it and how they can improve. You'll see on the last slide there is Adam's details, as well as you can email commercial@stbb.co.za, or obviously Adam at adami@stbb.co.za, but we'll share those details in the emails to follow with the recording. Just to go through a few questions that we had, and we'll see what we had time for. I think firstly, Adam, you answered quite a few of them, but the first one I wanted to address was from Agnella, who said, if you are from another African country, but you are now a South African citizen, but you only came into the country after the year 2000, are you considered BEE?
Yeah, the short answer is no. You had to get your citizenship by naturalization pre-1994, and the idea being is that unless you're born South African or South African by descent, you shouldn't benefit from the BEE laws unless you suffered under apartheid. The one exception to that is if you got your citizenship post-1994, but you were denied citizenship pre-1994 because of apartheid laws. So you'd need to bring some sort of evidence that you tried to get your citizenship, but because of racially affected laws at the time, pre-94, you couldn't get it, and you subsequently then got it.
Right. I think that answers that question. Then Renee had an interesting question regarding if you sell a share or an asset in your business to get the ownership points, are the points only due to you in the year of sale and ownership transfer?
No, it carries on for as long as that black shareholder holds the shares, and even after they sell their shares, you may be able to get some more points under the continuing consequences I mentioned earlier.
Okay, great. Then the next question, I think Desiree had quite a long question there. The desire for change must come from the business. We still see many who are stuck in the past, in particular real estate. I think this is just a comment more regarding BE. I think those are the questions that I see. I don't know whether I've missed any questions. If there's any question that you would like us to also answer, and you're always more than welcome to email us. I've also just added Adam's email address to the chat box, and you can, get in contact with Adam regarding your transfers or BEE compliance and any agreements and so on that you would like to put together. I think if there's nothing else from anyone, then that would conclude our webinar. Thank you so much, Adam, for today's session and for sharing with us those valuable insights regarding BEE and the business environment that I think a lot of us are not very familiar with. I myself am included. So thank you so much, everyone, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.